The echo of laughter ripples through the polished, silent halls of the corporate building. Charles Freeman, the janitor, pushes his cleaning cart down the corridor. His steps are deliberate, unhurried, as he glances up at the sleek glass walls of the boardroom. Through the thin crack of the door, he hears voices, laughter. It's not the kind that's warm or friendly. No, it's the kind of laughter that sends a chill through the spine, the kind that makes you feel small. He pauses, just for a second, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow, not from physical labor, but from the heat of discomfort. Inside the boardroom, the laughter grows louder. His heart tightens as he hears one of the executives, a tall man in an expensive suit, imitating him, mocking the way he mops the floors, the exaggerated movements, the grimace on his face. Another exec, this one with short-cropped hair and a snide grin, leans back in his chair, eyes gleaming with amusement. "Wonder if he even knows what we do here," he says, barely containing his laughter. The others join in, chuckling. Charles's hand tightens on the mop handle. He knows what they're doing. They don't see him. Not really. They don't care to. A small, silent breath escapes his lips. His steps continue, slow but steady, as if nothing's wrong. The sound of his wheels squeaking against the polished floor is the only thing louder than their laughter. He walks past the door, not sparing them a glance. And just before he disappears around the corner, a single, quiet thought flickers in his mind. What they didn't know: the man they were laughing at built the very floor they stood on. The sound of the mop handle tapping the ground fades away. But the story was only just beginning. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from viewers around the world. Charles Freeman stands at just under 6 feet. His body's still strong for a man in his mid-60s, though the years of labor have left their marks. Wrinkles etch his face like the weathered pages of an old book, and his hands, calloused and worn, bear testament to decades of unacknowledged work. His hair, once thick and dark, is now graying at the temples, combed neatly into place. Yet there's a quiet dignity about him that catches the eye of anyone who takes the time to look. Every morning, without fail, Charles arrives at the office before the sun fully rises. He doesn't need to check the clock. He's always early, a habit born out of necessity, precision, and a strong sense of discipline instilled in him long ago. His janitor's cart is always organized to perfection. His mops, brooms, and cleaning supplies placed in their proper slots, each item gleaming as if it, too, were treated with the care of something far more important than just tools for cleaning. Despite his silent demeanor, Charles is a man of routine. The staff call him Mr. Freeman, a term of respect they use even though most never speak to him directly. He's always there, quietly observing, moving through the halls with a methodical calmness, never rushing, never complaining. For those who work around him, Charles is a steady presence, an almost invisible fixture in the backdrop of the company's bustling day-to-day operations. To the senior executives, Charles is little more than a blur. He's the invisible worker, the one who clears their coffee cups and mops the floors they tread upon. They barely acknowledge his existence, except perhaps when he's in their way, silently working while they're in meetings or hurriedly dashing from one office to the next. His presence doesn't seem to matter to them, yet they hardly understand the depth of the man they disregard. But it's not the executives that Charles is concerned with. His focus is elsewhere, on the people who don't have the power to dismiss him as insignificant. The junior employees, the ones at the bottom of the corporate ladder, the ones who share the same silent struggles he knows all too well. Charles Freeman wasn't always the quiet janitor, silently mopping the floors of a boardroom full of executives who never looked his way. No, there was a time when his name carried weight, a time when his intellect and ambition could have taken him to the highest ranks in corporate America. But the journey wasn't as simple as it might seem. In the early 1970s, Charles Freeman was a young man brimming with potential. He had grown up in the segregated South, where doors were often slammed in the faces of Black people seeking equality and opportunity. Yet, despite the systemic racism that had pervaded every aspect of his life, Charles had excelled. His brilliance shone in high school and college, where he studied engineering, a field dominated by white men who looked down upon him. not only because of his race, but because of the underestimation of his intellect. Charles's skills were unmatched. He was an innovator, a problem solver, with an eye for detail that even his professors admired. But for all his achievements, the discrimination he faced in the academic world was only the beginning. In the corporate world, it would be even worse. In the early years of his career, Charles had an opportunity that many would have envied, a chance to co-found a small tech manufacturing firm with two partners, both of whom were white. The firm, based in a small town with aspirations of expanding into the high-tech industry, was eager to make its mark. Charles was the engineer behind the designs, the visionary who could see the future before others even understood the problems of today. He developed systems and machines that were ahead of their time, earning respect among his colleagues for his ingenuity. But as the company grew, so did the barriers. The higher the company climbed, the more exclusive and discriminatory the boardrooms became. Charles watched, helpless as his partners, who had no more knowledge of engineering than the average college graduate, rose through the ranks. They sat at the tables where the real decisions were made, while Charles remained in the background. At first, he assumed that his time would come, that his accomplishments and his intelligence would eventually force them to recognize his worth. But the recognition never came. Instead, he found himself relegated to a secondary role while his white partners moved into positions of power, making decisions he knew were less informed than those he could make. The reality hit him hard when he attended a board meeting one afternoon in the late 1970s. Charles was presented with a business proposal that was lacking in logic, full of gaps that only someone with his background could have noticed. He raised his concerns calmly and logically, pointing out the flaws in the plan. But instead of taking his advice seriously, his colleagues laughed. One of them, John, the majority shareholder, had the audacity to suggest that Charles might have missed a few things because this isn't the kind of work for someone like you. Charles sat in stunned silence, the sting of the racial bias biting deeper than anything he had ever faced. He had never imagined that the very people he had helped elevate would now dismiss him so casually, not just because of his ideas, but because of his race. He realized then that even with all his talent, even with his contributions to the company, he would never truly be allowed to rise to the level of power where his voice could be heard, not in a space that would always see him as other. So, Charles made a decision. He chose to step back. He kept his share in the company, but relinquished any active role in the business. He didn't need to be at the front of the room. It was clear that being an engineer and a shareholder would allow him to live his life without facing the constant insult of being ignored. He withdrew, leaving the daily grind to his partners while he focused on his family and personal life. Years passed. Charles's family grew, and he focused on his personal life, spending time with his wife Denise and their children. But tragedy struck. His wife Denise was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and for the first time in years, Charles was faced with a new set of challenges that took him away from the life he had carefully built. Watching his wife fight for her life was a painful process, but it also changed him. He realized that he had spent so many years trying to outrun the injustice and prejudice in his professional life that he had neglected the importance of staying grounded and connected to the people who truly mattered: his family, his community, and the workers he had once admired. As Denise's condition worsened, Charles made a decision that would further shape the rest of his life. Instead of remaining a silent shareholder, distanced from the day-to-day workings of the business, he returned to the company in a far humbler capacity. He took on a janitorial role, cleaning floors, scrubbing surfaces, performing menial tasks that no one ever acknowledged. The work was physically taxing, especially with his wife's illness weighing on his heart, but it allowed him to do something that had always mattered to him: stay close to the people who made the company run. He didn't tell anyone who he was. Charles Freeman, the brilliant engineer, the co-founder of the company, was now just another faceless worker in the building. But he wasn't there to make money. He wasn't there to prove anything. He was there to observe, to see how leadership had evolved since he had walked away, to watch how people treated the least powerful, Charles, with his vast knowledge of the company, knew that the workers, whether they were junior employees or administrative staff, were often ignored, just as he had been years ago. As a janitor, he was in a perfect position to see things from a completely different perspective. He watched how the executives operated, how they made decisions from behind closed doors, how they treated the people they saw as beneath them. And, as he suspected, nothing had changed. The disdain, the indifference, and the subtle but clear prejudice were still there, simmering beneath the surface. Charles wasn't surprised. He had always known that these attitudes were entrenched, part of the very fabric of corporate culture. But now, as he swept the floors and cleaned the boardrooms, he could see just how deep the rot went. He could hear the condescending remarks about diversity hires and lazy workers. He could see the way employees of color were treated, ignored in meetings, given menial tasks, and never given the chance to rise. And, more than anything, he could see how the executives, the very people who mocked him, were blind to the contributions of the people who truly made the company function. Charles Freeman had built the company, but in the eyes of those who reaped the rewards, he was just a janitor now. However, Charles was no fool. He knew that his time would come, and when it did, it would be the culmination of a life spent in the shadows, observing and waiting for the perfect moment. The company, once a small startup with humble beginnings, had grown into a sleek, successful conglomerate, a juggernaut in the tech manufacturing world. Its logo gleamed on the corner of the building, a symbol of wealth and achievement that was broadcasted on every billboard, magazine, and business conference panel. To the outside world, it was a beacon of success, modern, innovative, and cutting edge. But within the walls, the truth was far darker. From the outside, the top floors of the building were a picture of power and prestige. The executive suite was immaculate, a spacious, glass-walled space that overlooked the entire city. Every room was furnished with the finest materials, with sleek, minimalist designs that screamed exclusivity and wealth. The building was a monument to the success of its founders, Charles Freeman among them, though his name no longer held any relevance in these high-rise offices. Inside the boardrooms, the men and women who ran the company were no longer the engineers and innovators who had started it all. They were businessmen and women, driven by profit margins and stock prices. The company was no longer about groundbreaking ideas or pushing the boundaries of technology. Now, it was about maintaining the status quo and enriching those at the top. The executives, many of whom had risen through the ranks by virtue of their connections and ability to play the corporate game, had become increasingly arrogant and dismissive. Their confidence bordered on delusion. They were untouchable. They did not need to answer to the lower-level employees who helped the company run. They had the power, and that power was wielded without mercy. Each executive was more concerned with maintaining their position of privilege than with the well-being of the employees beneath them. They took pride in flaunting their wealth, often boasting about vacations on private yachts or discussing their expensive cars in passing. They cut corners at every opportunity, driven by a desire for greater profits, all while pretending that they were still concerned about the company's mission or its employees' welfare. This was a culture built on mockery and elitism, one where the workers below were either invisible or beneath contempt. The staff turnover at the company had become a constant problem. Despite the company's growing revenue, the talent pool seemed to be in a perpetual state of flux. New recruits came and went, their idealism crushed within months by the oppressive and toxic atmosphere that had come to define the workplace. Many of the younger employees, eager and optimistic when they first arrived, quickly realized that their aspirations of growth and advancement were nothing more than an illusion. The executives, so removed from the reality of the day-to-day operations, never seemed to notice the revolving door of staff. They simply hired new talent, replaced those who left, and continued their march towards more profits, more prestige, more recognition. The real question of why so many people were leaving never seemed to cross their minds. The truth was clear to anyone who had spent time in the company for any length of time. The leadership was toxic. They prided themselves on their exclusivity and their ability to dominate the industry. but they failed to acknowledge the ways in which they were driving away the very people who had helped them get there. People left because they were treated like expendable commodities, their contributions undervalued, and their voices ignored. As a janitor, Charles Freeman saw everything. From his position, he could observe the insidious behaviors and interactions that shaped the culture of the company, behaviors that no one else seemed to acknowledge or care about. He watched as the executives mocked employees behind their backs, often making jokes about their intelligence or work ethic based on their race, gender, or appearance. Microaggressions were a constant fixture in the workplace, with offhand comments about lazy minorities, incompetent women, or weak, entitled millennials permeating the conversations of those in power. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the executive floor, casting a golden shimmer across the polished marble floors. It was Thursday, the day of the quarterly board meeting. The kind of meeting where strategy, budgets, and bonuses were hammered out behind closed glass doors. A day when suits were sharper, voices louder, and arrogance practically dripped from the walls. Charles Freeman was there, as he always was, 30 minutes before his shift officially started. He never needed to clock in to prove his presence. His internal discipline was stronger than any time card. Today, like all other days, he moved with quiet purpose. His mop and cleaning cart glided softly across the floor. The hum of expensive shoes and the low murmur of executive voices were just background music. The boardroom, room 17A, sat at the end of the corridor. Charles had cleaned it just the night before, ensuring the mahogany table gleamed and the corners of the plush carpet were squared to perfection. He never left fingerprints. That was part of his ethic, his pride. Clean spaces, order in chaos, dignity in silence. As he passed room 17A, he heard the sound before he registered it. Laughter, uncontained and unfiltered. Not the kind of restrained, half-smile chuckle executives gave during presentations. This was the real kind. Deep, careless, ugly. He paused, just enough to lean his mop handle against the cart. His back straightened imperceptibly. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the boardroom scene unfolded like a theater stage. A dozen high-powered men and women in $1,000 suits, hunched over branded water bottles and untouched notepads. At the head of the table sat Andrew McMillan, Vice President of Operations. Loud, smug, always half a glass of whiskey away from saying something inappropriate. "I swear to God, if that old janitor gets any slower, we're gonna have to promote him just to get him off this floor," McMillan quipped, his voice carrying just enough for Charles to hear it. The table erupted in laughter. Another voice chimed in. Melanie, a new director of strategy who had quickly learned the social currency of cruelty. "Seriously though, do you think he even knows what we do here?" David, a thin, wiry man with a reputation for backhanded comments, added, "He probably thinks a P&L statement is some kind of cleaning solvent." More laughter. Then, the moment that changed everything. One of them, Charles couldn't see who, rose from his chair, exaggeratedly bent over, and began mimicking a mopping motion. "Look at me," the man said in a faux southern accent. "I'm Mr. Freeman, Lord of the Tiles." Even louder laughter now, the kind that drowns out conscience. The kind of laughter people reserve for when they know they're not being watched, or think they're not. Charles didn't move. He didn't flinch. His face was unreadable. He just stood there. Not humiliated, not angry, just still. That stillness stretched for several seconds longer than comfort would normally allow. Then, with the quietest of sighs, Charles picked up his mop handle, placed it back on the cart, and straightened his uniform shirt. Without a word, without a look through the glass, he turned, his movements fluid, dignified, and pushed his cart down the hallway. But not toward the supply room. He rolled it instead toward the executive elevator. It wasn't a space the janitorial staff was supposed to use. The badge access was programmed for C-level employees only. The elevator, decked in brushed aluminum and imported stone, was a status symbol, a gateway between decision-makers and the rest of the world. Charles reached into his pocket and withdrew an old, worn access badge, different from the standard blue janitor ID clipped to his chest. This one was matte black with a faded gold emblem and a strip of coating from a time when security systems were simpler. He swiped the badge. A small green light blinked. The elevator doors parted. He entered without looking back. As the doors closed, the scene in the boardroom continued. The jokes gave way to more serious discussion: profit margins, workforce reductions, upcoming product releases. But none of them noticed what had just happened. None of them saw the moment shift. None of them realized that the man they mocked didn't just clean their offices, he helped build the company they were sitting in. And in that instant, without anyone knowing it, the floor beneath them began to shift. Charles stood silently in the elevator, unmoving as the floor numbers ticked upward. His face remained calm, eyes steady, but inside something was stirring. Not rage, not vengeance, something deeper, a reckoning. When the doors opened, he wasn't on the janitor's floor. He had gone higher, to the very top. The executive suite, silent, untouched for now. He stepped out, alone, and walked down the hallway toward a room that had long since been forgotten. A room filled with archives, blueprints, ledgers, evidence. He was ready. They had laughed. But Charles Freeman? He was about to remind them who built the foundation they stood on. He approached the biometric scanner, its sleek design a testament to the company's technological prowess. Placing his hand on the scanner, a soft chime acknowledged his access. The door slid open, revealing an office preserved in time. Inside, sunlight filtered through large windows, illuminating a space adorned with awards, personal photographs, and the original founding documents of the company. The room exuded a quiet dignity, echoing the legacy of its occupant. Charles moved to the antique desk, its surface meticulously organized. He retrieved a tablet, accessing the company's internal communication system. With deliberate keystrokes, he scheduled an emergency board meeting, leveraging his rights as a majority shareholder. Downstairs, executives received the unexpected summons. Confusion rippled through the ranks. Emergency meetings were rare, and the sender's identity raised eyebrows. Whispers filled the corridors as they made their way to the boardroom. As they settled into their seats, the door opened. Charles entered, now wearing a clean blazer over his janitor uniform. The room fell silent, the juxtaposition striking. One executive chuckled, attempting levity. "Is this some kind of performance?" Charles approached the head of the table, his gaze steady. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice calm yet commanding. He placed a stack of documents on the table. Comprehensive reports detailing toxic behaviors, employee exit interviews, and overlooked financial ethics violations. "I am Charles Freeman, co-founder and majority shareholder of this company," he stated. "I've observed the culture that's taken root here. The mockery, the arrogance, the disregard for integrity." He paused, letting his words resonate. "I watched, I waited, and I gave you rope. You used it to build a throne, but it's not yours anymore." The room remained silent, the weight of his revelation settling over the assembled executives. Just days after the emergency board meeting, changes began to roll through the company like a cleansing storm. No press release, no dramatic announcements, just quiet, calculated actions. By the end of the week, 5 top-level executives, those who had led the mockery in the boardroom, those whose names appeared most often in complaints, those whose leadership had fostered a toxic, elitist culture, were gone. Some were escorted out with their belongings in boxes. Others were notified through court legal briefings and non-negotiable termination clauses. The silence that followed their departures echoed loudly in the hallways, where once they had barked orders and shared private jokes behind closed doors. Then came the resignation of the head of HR. Officially, it was personal reasons, but everyone knew why. Under her leadership, complaints had vanished into a black hole. Whispers of bias were ignored, exit interviews were sugar-coated, redacted, or buried. She'd become more of a gatekeeper than a guardian. And now that gate was wide open. In her place, Charles reinstated someone from the past, a former HR director who had left the company years ago, disillusioned by the growing disconnect between the company's values and its leadership. She returned, this time with full independence and a direct reporting line to Charles himself. Next, Charles reinstated a role that had been quietly eliminated years ago, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. Not just as a formality, but with teeth. Budget, authority, and access to every department head. Then, in what many saw as the most shocking move yet, Charles walked into the analyst bullpen, where rows of junior staff worked long hours underappreciated, and began calling names. "Tamika," he said softly. A junior analyst who rarely spoke above a whisper looked up in disbelief. Javier, Theo, Emily, Tia. 5 young, overlooked employees. Each of them had submitted at least one HR report that had gone unanswered. Each of them had been praised by peers but passed over for promotion. "I want you on a new advisory panel. You'll be working with me directly. 2 hours a week," Charles said simply. The future of this company should include voices that were never invited into the room. The room fell quiet, then a murmur of disbelief. Tamika blinked rapidly, trying to process it. Javier, normally stoic, cracked a smile. Tia, hands trembling slightly, said, Are you serious?" Charles nodded. "I don't play with people's dignity. Not then, not now." Over the next few days, word spread like wildfire. The janitor, who had moved quietly through the halls for years, had turned out to be the architect of the building. The quiet man who had fixed paper jams, refilled soap, and swept corners no one else noticed, was the founder. Now, those who had ignored or mocked him shifted uncomfortably in their routines. Some avoided eye contact. Others tried to pretend they'd always been friendly. But the most meaningful reactions came not from the guilty, but from the unseen. A young black intern approached him hesitantly one morning, near the same elevator Charles had once wheeled his cart into. I just wanted to say, I thought no one saw us," he said, voice cracking slightly. "I didn't think anyone with power cared." Charles smiled gently, placing a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "I saw everything," he said, "and now, so will everyone else." Later that week, an older Latina secretary, who had once discreetly left extra food in the staff fridge for Charles, walked into his office holding a small potted plant. "You kept this alive," she said with tears in her eyes, setting it on his desk. "You kept us alive." And slowly the company began to shift. The fear started to lift. People began to speak again in the elevators, not just to those above them, but to those beside and below. Whispers gave way to conversations. Small laughs returned in the hallways, but this time not cruel ones. The executive floor saw new faces, and more importantly, heard new voices. Charles didn't change everything overnight. He didn't have to. His actions had reminded everyone of something far more powerful than policy or position: dignity, justice, accountability. And the message was clear. Power is not in how loudly you speak, but in how long you're willing to listen. The janitor, Charles Freeman, once invisible in his Navy uniform, now walked the same halls. Still early, still quiet, still meticulous. His presence hadn't changed, but the way people saw him had. Junior employees smiled first now, held the door longer, spoke with respect, not pity. Executives, those who remained, greeted him with the kind of nod reserved for founders, or perhaps something even more rare, foundations. He had never demanded attention. He didn't take on a title or mount a dramatic return. He still carried his mop, still wheeled the same cart, still asked no one for applause. Because for Charles, this was never about revenge, never about spectacle. It was about a promise, made long ago in a boardroom where his voice didn't fit. A promise made to himself and to those who would come after. Dignity is not tied to a suit or a title. Humility is not weakness. And power, real power, doesn't need to announce itself. If this story made you feel something, share it.